Hello, everybody. Thank you for still being here towards the end of the day. I realize that, people have trains and planes and automobiles to catch, so I'll try and make this as quick and entertaining as I can. So, first of all, a few questions. Who here has heard of the FIDO Alliance? Okay, a couple of hands. I'm seeing some hands. It's okay. Who here has heard of passkeys? Okay, a few more hands. Okay, that's interesting. Who here knows what phishing is? Okay, that's good. Everybody who doesn't have their hand up, I've got a camera out the back. Your assessor is going to be coming and checking on you a little bit later on, because you probably should know what phishing is. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about authentication and how we can help make sure that these kind of attacks are less applicable into the future. So this presentation was actually put together in support and with the help of FIDO Alliance. Unfortunately, they can't be with me today, but a little bit about FIDO Alliance, because not everybody in the audience knows who they are. They're an open industry association focused on reducing the world's reliance on passwords. Now, to accomplish this, FIDO promotes the development and use of standards that allow for authentication and device attestation. FIDO Alliance fulfills its mission through the publishing of technical specifications, through industry certification programs, and through market adoption programs. I'm not really going to be talking about any of those, but that is background on who FIDO is. So when we talk about authentication, it's sometimes difficult to separate our personal experiences of authentication with what we do or what we know in an IT context. So we've got a long history of authenticating individuals that's kind of baked into our DNA. When we have a conversation with somebody, we know who we're talking to, we know that person, we recognize them from the way they look and the way they act and the way they talk and the way they behave. Everything builds up that kind of authentication of the person that you're speaking to. And if you turned around and you look back and suddenly they've been replaced by somebody else, well, you'd know that instantly, because they would look different, they would act different, they would behave different, they would be a different person. But unfortunately, that's not necessarily true on the internet or in the context of IT security. Nobody really knows who anybody is on the other side of the system. We don't have that. And yet, we've got kind of some of those assumptions baked into how we do authentication. But it's okay, because we've also got some history, not quite that very long, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years history of individual face-to-face conversation and interaction. We do have some history around the use of passwords and passcodes and, coming up to a door in a castle and knocking on it and giving the secret code. And that's great, and that used to work really well. However, on the internet, the problem we've got is computers are better at these things than we are. They're better at generating passwords, they're better at sending passwords across, they're better at storing passwords, they're better at remembering passwords. We're just not as good at computers, at passwords as computers are. So, okay, maybe we just need to make the passwords longer. And that's certainly something that we have, for example, in PCI SSC version 4.x, 4.0 and 4.0.1, where we say, you know what, into the future you might need 12 character passwords with additional complexity in there. But fundamentally, we're still fighting against computers that do this better than we do. Because the foundation of authentication using passwords is fundamentally flawed, because computers are better at these things than we are. And most of the attacks that we see are based on the exploit of poor authentication. So you can bypass these passwords, yes, but you can also bypass some aspects of MFA, multi-factor authentication, where perhaps you've got a one-time password code and that's being sent, but people can intercept that code, they can phish that code, and then use that to then gain access. And once they've got access, once again, it's not like you're talking to an individual. Once they're in and authenticated, essentially. Generative AI, of course, makes this much more difficult. And some of these figures here, it feels like there's a decimal point that's missing somewhere, but these are the actual numbers. For example, rise in malicious phishing emails since 2 years ago, basically, 1,265%. Not double, but tenfold, 100-fold increase there. So we do have options to address this. As I mentioned, you can use MFA. You can have multi-factor authentication, something that you're coupling with the password, something you know, in terms of something that you are, like a biometric, or something that you have with you, you physically possess, like a security key or something like that. This makes the ability to guess the password or brute force the password less useful because you need to have something else that's coupled with it. However, as mentioned, those things can sometimes be phished. You can have the authentication process, you enter your password, you have an OTP, perhaps on an app on your phone or on some sort of key fob. If somebody is sitting in the middle of that, they can intercept those codes, or perhaps they can do an attack where they send you a false link and you click into that, and you enter your password and your OTP, they get those, and they can use those in a legitimate context. So when we talk about authentication then, we need to think about how things have evolved and how they can be attacked. So if we start with a non-complex password, your general kind of your mother's maiden name, your dog's name, your birthday date, these sorts of things, that's where it's really easy to guess the password. You can do credential stuffing where you've stolen passwords from various databases and you just keep on trying them because maybe sometimes people use passwords again. I don't know, I'm going to do another survey here. Who here has got a password in any sort of context where when they have to change it, you know what, you just add a 1 or a 2 or a 3 or a 4 on the end of that. Who does that? Okay, I think I see one person being honest and the rest of you being dishonest in the audience here. So we can fix that, though. We can have complex passwords where they're managed potentially in the context of some sort of password safe or something like that, password manager. And that can help with guessing. It becomes very difficult to guess a complex password. But if those passwords are being reused, or if there's something where you're just incrementing the number at the end of it, then it is still a problem because you can still potentially do credential stuffing and so forth. And phishing, of course, is still there. So let's have complex, unique passwords. This is really where you do need some sort of method to manage your individual passwords because you might have many, many, many of them. So that's going to stop your brute forcing and, your credential stuffing. Brute forcing could still be a problem because computers are better at this than we are. And they're only getting better at it. Now, maybe if it's online, you may not be able to do that. That takes time. But if someone can steal that password database and try and attack it offline, computers are very, very good at going through all possible combinations to try and figure out what that password might be. This is where we end up with complex password plus something like an OTP, which is great. That's an MFA. That does work. But it is still possible to have that phished, to have somebody steal the password and the OTP in a particular context of an authentication session and use that. If we have phishing-resistant authentication, then that phishing factor, that phishing attack vector goes away. You still have the possibility of underlying technology problems. I mentioned the fact that when we authenticate a person we talk to, if we turned away and we started talking again, they're a different person, we'd recognize that instantly. Doesn't necessarily happen in the context of computer authentication, where when you authenticate, you actually get a session token generally, and once that session token exists, that can be passed around and potentially used. And that's where device binding and things can actually help with those sorts of attacks as well. So, talked a lot about the history. Let's move on to how we do solve some of these problems. We're going to be talking a little bit about phishing-resistant authentication, as well as passkey. Now, I have to say at this point, The Council does not have a formal stance on passkeys. We do have some requirements around phishing-resistant authentication I'll get to. But passkeys are essentially a form of phishing-resistant authentication that can actually be synced across multiple devices. So how does phishing-resistant authentication work? It's based on cryptography, based on public key cryptography. With a password, you have a secret. That secret is the password. You know the password, and you give that secret, that password, to somebody else, the server, the system, whatever it is that you want to authenticate to, and they know the secret as well. The secret is the same. So if somebody compromises the server, or if you've used the same secret, and they can try it again, then they can access those systems, because by compromising the server, by compromising other systems where you've used the same secret, they know the secret. They don't have to compromise you to get that secret. In the context of phishing-resistant authentication, you do not give the party that you're authenticating to any secrets. You give them what's called a public key. And that public key can then be used in a challenge response protocol so that you have a private key that's associated with that, and they can verify that you are the owner of the public key that was provided. You have that identity, and therefore they can allow you in. If that server is compromised, they get the public key. That doesn't allow them to authenticate as you at all. That public key only allows them to authenticate you. So that is why we have this phishing resistance. You can't have somebody impersonating another system, because in order to do that, they would need to have the public key and the private key. You would need to authenticate to them. If you did that, that doesn't help authenticating to the other system, because they need that session token that is going to be provided after the authentication by that other system. So with passkeys, as mentioned, same sort of thing. You can have the user. The user provides what's referred to as a gesture. Now, that gesture can be one of many different things. It doesn't necessarily always add up to a second factor necessarily, because it can be something simple as a swipe potentially. That authenticator then challenge response protocol as mentioned, but you can have with passkeys these cryptographic keys, these private keys, synced across multiple systems. Once again, we will be coming out with authentication guidance. We will have some more details on this. At the moment, we don't have a formal stance on syncable credentials, such as passkeys that can be synced across multiple devices. That allows for cross-device authentication. I'll skip over that for now. So where can we use this? What are passkeys? I'm talking about this thing. This sounds great. You know, how long is it going to be before this is out here? We have FIDO-based authentication baked into almost all of the major operating systems. In fact, I would say all of the major operating systems at this point. It's right there. It's also baked into many different authentication provider systems. And I would actually recommend, not just from a PCI point of view, but from a personal point of view, for your personal accounts, and I do this myself, if you have the ability, if you have an online account with anything, and they offer you the ability to use a passkey, I would strongly suggest you do that. It provides much better security, and people are moving to this at quite a pace at the moment. So, okay, it's supported. Are people using it? People are using this authentication increasingly around the world. We have a lot of websites, as I say, migrating to it. We have a lot of services migrating to it. And there is provable evidence that this actually works. And so that proof is in companies, large companies, that have deployed this type of technology. And it has not only made things a little bit quicker for them, but it's also made things more secure. So it's not just about the security aspect. Security aspect's great, that's why I'm here. It also makes the whole authentication process a little bit more seamless, a little bit more frictionless, let's say. And so some good stats I don't have on this slide from Google. When they implemented this a few years ago in terms of FIDO-based authentication, they rolled it out across their whole population of employees. They went from a number of phishing attempts every day to basically having no exploitable phishing attempts occurred into the future. Microsoft have just recently implemented passkey-based or FIDO-based authentication in their systems as part of a security posture that they're taking as well. So I mentioned we have this in our requirements. So we have a couple of requirements on authentication, specifically multi-factor authentication within PCI DSS version 4.0.1. This is actually one of the changes we made in PCI DSS version 4.0.1. So we have 8.4.1. MFA is implemented for all non-console access into the CDE by personnel with administrative access. Now here, you can use phishing-resistant authentication. I would strongly recommend that you do use phishing-resistant authentication, although it's not a requirement. But if you are doing that, it must be coupled with some sort of additional factor. It must still be multi-factor. However, we have requirement 8.4.2, where MFA is required to be implemented for all non-console access into the CDE, not just administrative, all access into the CDE. This is a requirement which is best practice until April of next year. Now here we have a caveat in PCI DSS version 4.0.1 that says this requirement does not apply to user accounts that are only authenticatable with phishing-resistant authentication factors. So if you're using phishing-resistant authentication, you don't need to implement MFA to comply with 8.4.2. Now, if you're wondering, when I say console access, what exactly console access means, some text here. This comes straight out of the standard. I won't repeat it, but just to let you know, we do have a definition of what that means, and it's important to understand. Also, something that does come up that I wanted to clarify while we're talking about authentication is that it is not a requirement that all authentication factors are validated at the same time under PCI DSS. Sometimes people are a little bit believe that you have to have all factors authenticated before any indication of success or non-success is returned. That is not the case. So, what is the end goal of this? What is the recommendations that I'm saying, essentially? Well, as I mentioned, computers are better at passwords than we are. And because of that, in PCI DSS version 4, we have implemented requirements around increasing the length of passwords. They're best practices at the moment, 12-character passwords coming as per April of 2025. Additionally, we have requirements around MFA for all non-console access, not just administrative, into the CDE in April of 2025. However, once again, if you have phishing-resistant authentication that you're using there, you can use that in place of MFA there. Now, ideally, as a recommendation, look to update to phishing-resistant authentication wherever you can. It is better than the use of passwords. You don't have to worry then about those 12-character passwords or MFA. Make sure, though, you're still securing your enrollment process, your authentication reset process. Think about those session tokens. Those are still attack vectors that exist within that context of phishing-resistant auth. And also bear in mind that when we talk about phishing-resistant auth, we're talking about systems that use cryptography. And we have a requirement in PCI DSS version 12.0. Sorry, not version, I apologize. PCI DSS 12.3.3 that talks about keeping an assay of the cryptography that you're using, making sure you understand it, because as we've seen in some of the talks throughout this conference, the attack threats around cryptography are changing, so you want to make sure that you have an understanding of that moving forward as well. So, if you want more, Here is a link to the FIDO website. You can have a look. Once again, this presentation was put together in concert with FIDO. There's more information out there. There's a lot of information out on this. Feel free to have a look and see what you can. So thank you very much. I will move on to the next presentation very soon. But now that I've gone through it, does anybody still not know what FIDO passkeys of phishing are? I can't even see anybody being sarcastic, which kind of disappoints me even a little bit. But OK, thank you very much.